What are the lessons learned from Evergrande?
Well, I think the Hong Kong bondholders and shareholders are going to be largely wiped out. There are some attempts to attach assets. They've not really managed to liquidate anything for more than a few cents on the dollar at this point. So I think for overseas investors investing in China through Hong Kong, it's that you have limited recourse to onshore assets if things go bad. So again, both bondholders and stockholders in Hong Kong, I think in most of these large developers, are going to largely end up with goose eggs. So that's the real lesson from the perspective of the overseas investor. The broader macro lesson is one that we're still dealing with in China, which is that the debts aren't going away. The companies will sort of cease to exist at some point, but no one is really owning up to the losses onshore. The banks are still owed a lot of money by these property companies. It's not money good. It's never coming back. Yet the losses aren't being recognized. And it's created an environment in China where really elevated levels of credit extension, 9% now credit growth up from below 8 last year, is seeing continued declines in activity. So fixed asset investment, 1.6% year to date, year on year. So more credit, it's financing less activity. Where is all the money going? It's going to roll this gathering pile of zombie assets that is weighing down the Chinese financial system and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future.
So we have a number of companies that are in line for liquidation hearings. Kaisa, they've done this before. They had a default. They were the first, in fact, managed to work that one out, only to default again. More recently, Times China, Sino-Ocean, Sunac, all of these names that have liquidation hearings on the cards, dates with the courts. What I want to know is, are we expected to see a similar fate play out for some of the other property names as well?
I think all of the large names are going to become zombies, basically. But unless the authorities onshore agree to liquidate the onshore assets, the liquidation orders don't really mean that much. They can only liquidate offshore assets that they can attach. In Evergrande's case, I think it was a property management company that had some assets in Hong Kong. But it's really, again, it's pennies on the dollar. So unless the policymakers onshore agree to liquidate these companies, sell the assets for what they can get, give that to the creditors and tell them that's all you get, mark the rest down, this will just, again, the system will have to carry the bad debts. And this has been the Chinese story for the last couple of decades. And again, this is why the economy is in debt deflation, because these debts never get resolved. And by the way, we could talk about the anti-involution campaign. It's going to be the same story. If you don't write down the debt, you're not addressing the problem.
Now, you kind of took the words out of my mouth, because we've seen overcapacity, overproduction in the mainland property sector. What happens when this overexpansion in property meets anti-involution?
Yeah, I think investors are misreading this anti-involution campaign somewhat. Now, if you take so in the solar industry, I think it's the 7 largest producers are going to form a cartel and take over the smaller producers and shut down the capacity. But if the banks don't write down the debt, then the large producers have to take on that debt. Now, they cut the supply of solar panels. That will push prices higher if supply contracts. But demand is going to fall if you raise the prices. So on an industry-wide basis, revenues will fall. It will be fewer units at higher prices, but that's less overall revenue for the industry, but you haven't reduced the level of debt that the industry is carrying. So it's just going to end up being an anchor that will eventually drag down the bigger, healthier producers if they get saddled with having to carry this debt.
Now, what's going on with some of these mainland property stocks? I don't want to put you on the spot here, but China Vanke, if you can see on your screen, is up 11%. We're looking at Kaisa up 6%. We got Long4 shares up 6.8%. Why is the market rallying so hard? What is it that they're cheering?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. I was scanning the news wires before I came on because I was afraid you might ask me that question. As you noted, Country Garden disappointing. They warned that they're going to miss. Evergrande's results last week were disappointing. So there's really nothing that I've seen in the news flow that would justify this. Although we are in, I think, somewhere probably in the early stages of the latest speculative frenzy in Chinese equities. So there was a very strong rally in the Hong Kong listed Chinese equities over the last several months as money flowed from onshore to Hong Kong, southbound via the Connect, to compress what was a very deep discount on Hong Kong listed stocks relative to its counterparts onshore. And now that speculative frenzy is spreading to the onshore stocks, which are trading very well over the last couple of weeks. I think this could continue simply because when we see momentum get ahead of steam in Chinese equity markets, it tends to run for a while. But if you look at the history, I looked at the data for the MSCI China Index the other day, 15 years of flat earnings per share. It's gone nowhere for 15 years. But over that time period, there have been several 50% rallies in the index that have then retraced. So this rally will end, as all the rest, anchored to those earnings per share, which are not going anywhere in a deflationary environment. But right now, it looks like we're, again, I think in the early stages of a bit of a speculative frenzy in China, which could take these onshore indices another 15 or 20% quite easily.
And we're already looking at the Shanghai Composite trading at 10-year highs. The mainland property sector at one point was 25% of a Chinese GDP. Since the troubles had started a couple years ago, that percentage has declined. How would you say the weight or the impact of what's happening in the Chinese property sector to the Chinese economy? What is the outlook?
Yeah, there's a lag between sales and construction activity. So construction activity in China tends to be a function of the last 5 years of sales because there's a 4 or 5 year cycle between the sale and delivery of the unit. And that cycle is actually lengthening. So if we look at the last 5 years back to 2020, the first 2 years were actually booming in terms of sales. And then 2021, as you noted, Evergrande cracked and we started to collapse in sales. But that means that even if sales flatline from here, and they're still falling 8 or 10% a year, but even if they go flat from here, as they complete the units that were sold over the last 5 years, construction activity will continue to decline for the next 2 to 2.5 years. So again, even if sales flatline, construction activity is only about halfway from its 2021 peak to where it will eventually end up. So this is going to continue to be a drag, pretty much baked in the cake for the next 2 years.
I'm going to put you on the spot again before we wrap up here. I'm curious to know if there are any standouts, any particular property developers that are weathering this better than others.
Well, the state-owned developers will end up running the entire industry. So policymakers in China are never going to let this bubble approach anything like we saw over the last 15 years. I think eventually these zombie companies will be rolled up into the state. You mentioned Vanke and Shenzhen Metro, I guess, a big investor. So the state entities will come in and ultimately fund the completion of these units to avoid the social stress that would occur if these developers don't deliver these units. And then they'll end up running the industry. And then it will be much easier for Chinese policymakers to wrap property into the central plan every 5 years. So we're simply not going back to an environment of, outsized profits in this industry like we saw in the last 15 years, I don't believe.